What if I told you that right now, as you're watching this video, millions of pounds of perfectly good American-grown food are rotting in fields across our country? Not because of drought, not because of disease, but because something in our agricultural system has fundamentally broken. This is devastating. Hundreds of millions of pounds of food are being abandoned in American fields this harvest season. Agricultural economists project losses in the billions, while grocery prices hit record highs. Sweet corn withering in Wisconsin, apples dropping unpicked in Washington orchards, lettuce browning in Arizona fields. But here's what's really troubling. This isn't about bad weather or crop disease. Many farmers and agricultural experts believe this reflects a deeper systemic failure that makes it actually cheaper for farmers to let their food rot than to harvest it. Sweet corn, the golden betrayal. Sweet corn, that perfect symbol of American summer, those golden ears dripping with butter at family barbecues, is rotting in fields across the Midwest while grocery stores stock frozen corn from overseas suppliers. I spoke with Jim, whose family has grown sweet corn in Wisconsin for 4 generations. My grandfather would roll over in his grave, Jim told me. We've got the best corn crop we've seen in years, and we can't even give it away. Regional reports suggest tens of thousands of acres of sweet corn have been left to rot this September. Labor costs jumped an estimated 45% from last season. Fuel prices stayed high at over $4.50 per gallon. But the real crisis came when major food processors started canceling contracts in late August, claiming excess inventory. But wait, if there's excess inventory, why are grocery stores still stocked with imported corn? Industry observers point to a troubling pattern. Processing plants that turn corn into frozen vegetables and canned goods had already committed to contracts with international suppliers. Many farmers believe they're being systematically cut out of their own domestic market. Jim tried direct sales, roadside stands, calling restaurants. You can't sell thousands of acres worth of corn one ear at a time, he said. The math doesn't work when you're competing against imported frozen corn. By early September, entire fields were being mowed down instead of harvested. Perfectly good corn was being chopped for cattle feed or left to decompose. But if you think sweet corn is devastating, wait until you see what's happening to America's apple orchards. Apples. When orchards become graveyards. Washington State produces 60% of America's apples, and this harvest season has been devastating for orchard owners. These trees take 7 to 10 years to mature and represent decades of investment. Industry estimates suggest massive quantities of apples worth hundreds of millions of dollars are rotting on trees across Washington State. The crisis started with spring frost damage, but the real devastation came during harvest. Labor shortages hit hard as seasonal workers found better-paying jobs elsewhere. The workers who showed up demanded wages that smaller orchards couldn't afford. But here's where the story gets truly concerning. While American apples rot on trees, industry sources report that major juice companies and food processors have increasingly sourced apple concentrate from international suppliers at prices that undercut domestic production by significant margins. Grocery chains have also increased their reliance on imported fresh apples. Some growers are considering removing trees their grandfathers planted. When apple orchards disappear, we're not just losing this year's crop, we're losing the capacity to grow apples for the next generation. But the apple crisis pales in comparison to what I found in Arizona's lettuce fields. Lettuce, the salad bowl crisis. Arizona's winter lettuce feeds much of America during cold months. But this season, I witnessed vast quantities of perfect lettuce wilting in the sun while Americans pay record prices for imported lettuce. The lettuce grew beautifully in the mild September weather. Perfect heads of iceberg, crisp romaine, tender butter lettuce. Everything looked normal till harvest time. That's when I discovered how broken our food distribution system has become. Packaging facilities that normally run continuously started reducing shifts, citing energy costs. Transportation companies raised shipping rates so dramatically that moving lettuce became unprofitable. Industry sources suggest shipping costs increased 50 to 75% in some regions. The result? Fields full of perfect lettuce with no economically viable way to get it to market. Lettuce doesn't wait. Once ready, you have maybe 48 hours before quality declines rapidly. Vast quantities of lettuce that could have filled salad bowls across America were left to wilt in the desert sun. Americans pay record prices for salads while perfect lettuce rots miles from major cities. The lettuce crisis runs deep. But what I discovered about onions reveals how this reaches every corner of American agriculture. Onions, the storage scandal. Georgia grows some of the finest onions in America, sweet Vidalia onions that have made Southern cooking legendary worldwide. But this year, I uncovered a storage crisis that reveals just how fragile our food system has become. The onions grew perfectly and were harvested on schedule in late August. These weren't just any onions. These were premium Vidalia onions, the kind that typically sell for premium prices in gourmet stores. The problem came with what happened next. Warehouse facilities that normally handle Georgia's onion crop have been operating at reduced capacity, citing energy costs. Meanwhile, food service companies have increasingly sourced from international suppliers offering lower prices. Energy costs for refrigeration have increased dramatically, making long-term storage difficult for American farmers. Restaurant chains report they've found it easier to work with importers than deal with domestic supply chain uncertainties. The sight of deteriorating onions is particularly heartbreaking because onions store well and could have provided affordable nutrition through the winter months. Instead, they're decomposing in storage, while Americans pay higher prices for imported alternatives. But the onion crisis is just the beginning. What I found with Idaho potatoes will shock you. Potatoes, the French fry betrayal. Idaho potatoes are legendary, the gold standard for everything from baking to French fries. But this season exposed a crisis so deep it reaches into every fast food restaurant and frozen food aisle in America. Here's what farmers are reporting. In September, major food processors began reducing their contracts with American growers, citing market conditions. Industry sources suggest these same companies had already committed to contracts with international suppliers. Industry estimates indicate massive quantities of Idaho potatoes, potentially worth hundreds of millions of dollars, are sitting in storage with limited buyers. That's enough potatoes to supply major food service operations for extended periods. Processing facilities have been operating at reduced capacity. Some shut down entirely, leaving growers with enormous quantities of potatoes and nowhere to sell them. While American potatoes sit in storage, major food service companies have increasingly sourced frozen products from international suppliers. The same companies that built their success on Idaho potatoes are now looking overseas. Perfect potatoes that could have fed American families are being used for cattle feed or disposed of. Some farmers question whether it's worth planting potatoes next year. But if you think potatoes are shocking, wait until you see what's happening to California's carrots. Carrots, the baby carrot crisis. California's carrot industry has been the backbone of American produce for decades, producing those familiar baby carrots and fresh carrots that fill every grocery store produce section. But this harvest season revealed a crisis so significant it will change how you look at every carrot you buy. Here's what many farmers are experiencing. While domestic carrots sit unharvested, major buyers have increasingly shifted to imported alternatives that cost significantly less than domestic production. Industry observers note that these imported carrots often have different safety and quality standards than American-grown produce. Processing facilities that wash, cut, and package those familiar baby carrots have reduced their intake from American farms. Grocery chains report they've found better profit margins with imported produce. Even though quality and safety standards may vary, regional estimates suggest massive quantities of California carrots, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, are being returned to the soil instead of feeding American families. That's enough carrots to supply major food service operations for extended periods. Unlike crops that store for months, carrots need quick processing after harvest. When facilities reduce intake from American farmers, entire crops become economically unviable overnight. Cabbage, the final piece. The final piece of this agricultural crisis is cabbage, and what I discovered here reveals how widespread these problems have become. Cabbage might seem simple, but it's essential for coleslaw, sauerkraut, and the ethnic cuisines that define American food culture. Farmers are reporting that while premium domestic cabbage sits in fields, food service companies that supply restaurants and institutions have increasingly sourced from international suppliers who can offer lower prices. The processing industry that turns cabbage into sauerkraut and other preserved foods has also shifted toward imported raw materials. Even though American cabbage often exceeds quality standards, the cost difference has become too significant for companies operating on tight margins in an inflationary environment. Agricultural experts note that imported cabbage often travels long distances and may have different safety standards than American-grown produce. Regional estimates suggest massive quantities of Wisconsin cabbage worth tens of millions are rotting in fields. What this really means. These 7 crops represent more than agricultural waste. Many experts believe they're evidence of systematic failure in American food production. When it becomes more profitable to import food from thousands of miles away than harvest crops in our backyard, critics argue that's a fundamental breakdown. Industry observers note that companies rejecting American produce are simultaneously importing alternatives from countries with different safety standards, lower labor costs, and government subsidies American farmers can't compete with. Agricultural economists suggest this represents a coordinated shift toward overseas food production, where companies can maximize profits while operating under different regulatory frameworks. But experts warn this isn't just about economics. Many believe this represents a significant threat to America's food security and agricultural independence. When farmers go out of business, their knowledge disappears. When processing facilities close, our capacity to handle domestic production is eliminated. When rural communities collapse, the networks supporting agriculture are destroyed. The food security warning. Agricultural security experts believe this crisis represents a serious threat to America's food independence. Food security advocates argue that food independence is as critical as energy independence. When we become overly dependent on other countries for basic nutrition, they warn we become vulnerable to supply disruptions, trade disputes, and political manipulation. Consider scenarios where international conflicts disrupt food imports, or where other countries use food exports as political leverage. The country that once fed the world could find itself struggling to feed its own people. This isn't some distant theoretical concern, experts warn. It's happening right now in September 2025. Every field left unharvested, every farmer forced out of business, every processing facility that closes makes us more dependent on others for our most basic need, Industry analysts note that China controls much of our soybean supply chain. Mexico dominates our fresh produce imports. Canada supplies significant grain when American farmers can't compete. Critics argue we're systematically dismantling our own food security while enriching countries that may not always share our interests. The human cost. Behind every rotting field is a human story of dreams deferred and livelihoods threatened. These aren't corporate executives making calculated business decisions. These are farming families who've worked the same land for generations, who measure success not just in dollars, but in the health of their soil and the quality of their crops. The psychological toll of watching your life's work rot in the field is devastating. Farmers who've never missed a harvest are being forced to abandon crops they've tended with care. The pride that comes from feeding your community is being replaced by frustration and uncertainty about the future. Rural communities that have supported agriculture for generations are watching their economic foundation weaken. When farms struggle, everything connected to agriculture feels the impact. Equipment dealers, banks, Main Street businesses, schools, churches. The social fabric of rural America is under stress. Small towns across the Midwest are facing challenges. Main streets have empty storefronts. Schools are consolidating. Churches have smaller congregations. The America that your grandfather knew is changing, one struggling farm at a time. The critical juncture. Agricultural experts warn we're approaching a critical point. Once infrastructure is lost, once knowledge disappears, once land is converted, it becomes extremely difficult to rebuild. It takes years to develop farming expertise, decades to build processing infrastructure, generations to develop the community knowledge supporting successful agriculture. Every day we delay addressing these issues, we potentially lose more capacity to feed ourselves. Every farmer who quits, every facility that closes, every acre out of production makes us more dependent on others. The crops rotting in fields across America today are more than wasted food. They're a warning that our food security may be eroding, our rural communities struggling, and our agricultural independence slipping away. 7 crops, hundreds of millions of pounds of waste. One troubling reality. American agriculture faces unprecedented challenges. From sweet corn in Wisconsin to cabbage fields across the Midwest, our food security is under pressure in real time. If this opened your eyes to the crisis facing American farmers, subscribe to stay informed about what's happening to our food supply. And watch the next video on your screen to learn what experts say we can do to support American agriculture before these challenges become irreversible.